They did not say much at first. It was in the way they looked, the quiet glances, the small pauses between words, the faint absence of belief that lingered in the air. Nothing loud, nothing harsh, just a feeling. And somehow, that feeling was heavier than any spoken doubt. He could sense it, even when no one spoke of it directly. It lived in the silence around him, in the way conversations shifted when he came close, in the way their eyes would soften with something that was not quite trust. It was subtle, but it was there, and he felt it. Have you ever felt something like that? When no one openly questions you, yet deep inside, you know they already have. He carried that weight quietly, not in anger, not in protest, but in a kind of still confusion, because part of him wondered if they were right, if what they saw was something he had missed within himself. There were moments when he almost spoke, moments when words gathered inside him, ready to explain, to defend, to prove. But each time, something held him back. Not fear, but a quiet hesitation, as if he knew that words, once released, would not change what had already been decided in their hearts. So he stayed silent, and in that silence, the world around him continued as it always had. They spoke, they moved, they carried on, but the distance remained. Not a distance of space, but something softer, something harder to reach. At times, the silence felt like a question with no answer. Why did they not believe? What had he done or not done? Was it something seen or something simply assumed? He searched for clarity, but found only more quiet. Yet, beneath that uncertainty, something else began to grow. Very small at first, almost unnoticeable. A kind of awareness, a realization that the doubt he felt from them was not entirely his to carry. Still, it stayed with him. He walked through his days with a calm face, but inside there was a gentle stirring, not loud enough to disturb him, but present enough that he could not ignore it, like a distant echo that kept returning when everything else grew quiet. And sometimes, in the stillest moments, he would pause and wonder, what does belief truly look like? Is it something given by others, or something that must be held within, even when no one else sees it? He did not have the answer, not yet. So he listened. He listened to the silence around him, to the spaces where words were missing, to the things that were never said but always felt. And slowly, without realizing it, he began to understand something deeper than their doubt. He began to see himself more clearly, not through their eyes, but through the quiet space they had left behind. And though the weight of not being believed still lingered, it no longer felt as heavy as before. It was still there, resting gently in his chest, but it had changed. It was no longer just a burden. It had become a question, a quiet, patient question, waiting for its answer. He began to notice the silence more carefully. Not just the silence around him, but the silence within. At first it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. There were no voices to guide him there, no reassurance, no agreement. Just a quiet space where his thoughts moved slowly, like ripples across still water. And in that space, everything felt more honest. They still watched him in the same way. Their doubt had not disappeared. If anything, it had settled into something even quieter, something more certain. They had already decided who he was or who he was not. And now, they no longer needed to question it out loud. But he no longer rushed to answer it either. Have you ever stopped explaining yourself? Not because you have nothing to say, but because you begin to feel that your words are not truly being heard. That was where he stood now. Not in defiance, not in pride, but in a quiet understanding that some things cannot be changed through speaking. There was a time when he believed that if he just found the right words, everything would shift. That clarity would bring acceptance. That effort would be seen. But now, something inside him had softened, not weakened, just quieter. He began to see that their doubt did not always come from truth. Sometimes it came from distance, from what they could not see, from what they had never taken the time to understand. And how could he force them to see if they had already chosen not to look? So he stepped back, not away from them, but away from the need to be understood by them. It was a small step, almost invisible, but it changed something within him. The silence that once felt heavy now felt different, still deep, still present, but no longer pressing down on him. Instead, it gave him space. Space to observe, to feel, to simply exist without the constant urge to explain himself. And in that space, he began to notice things he had missed before. The way his thoughts would settle when he stopped chasing their approval. The way his breath felt calmer when he no longer tried to fill every quiet moment with justification. The way his presence became steadier. Even when nothing around him had changed, they still doubted him. That part remained, but something else had shifted. Their doubt no longer reached him in the same way. It touched the surface, but did not sink as deeply as before. It no longer defined the way he saw himself. And that was new. He did not announce this change. He did not show it. There were no visible signs, no sudden transformations, just a quiet, steady shift happening within. He began to understand that not every silence is empty. Some silences are full of things that cannot be easily spoken, full of growth that happens slowly without witness. And perhaps this was one of those silences. He did not rush it. He did not try to turn it into something more. He simply allowed it to be, and in doing so, he started to feel something he had not felt before, a gentle sense of grounding, as if for the first time he was no longer standing on uncertain ground shaped by their opinions, but on something quieter, something more his own. It was not loud. It was not complete. But it was real, and in that quiet realization, he no longer felt the same need to break the silence. He could remain within it and not feel lost. There were still moments when the old feeling returned, A passing glance, a quiet exchange between them, a subtle shift in the air that reminded him of what they believed about him. And for a brief second, something inside him would tighten, as if the past was gently knocking again. But now, he did not open the door so quickly. He noticed it instead. He noticed how quickly the mind tries to react, how it searches for something to say, something to prove, something to defend. It was almost instinctive, like a habit formed over time. And yet, he began to see that not every feeling needed to become a response. So he let it pass. Not by force, not by suppression, but by simply allowing it to be there without following it. The discomfort would rise, linger, and then, slowly, it would fade on its own. And in those quiet moments, he discovered something unexpected. Strength does not always move. Sometimes it stays still. Have you ever felt that kind of stillness? The kind where you could speak, but choose not to. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. That was what began to grow within him. They still misunderstood him. They still saw only what they had decided to see. And perhaps they always would. But he no longer felt the same urgency to correct them, because he was beginning to understand something deeper, something that could not be taken away by doubt or shaped by opinion. Not every truth needs to be proven. Some truths are lived quietly. He started to see that reacting would not bring him closer to peace. It would only pull him back into the same cycle, the same need to be seen, to be accepted, to be believed, and that cycle no longer felt like where he belonged. So he stepped out of it, gently, without announcement, without resistance, just a quiet decision made within himself. He chose to remain steady even when things around him felt uncertain. He chose to listen more than he spoke, and when words did come, they were fewer, softer, more certain. There was no longer a rush behind them, and something about that quiet presence began to change the way he moved through the world. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that no longer depended on it. The silence he once feared had become something else entirely. It had become a place where he could return to, where he could rest, where he could remember who he was without the noise of others' expectations. And in that place, he was not questioned. He was not measured. He simply was. It did not mean the outside world had changed. They still carried their doubts. They still held their quiet judgments. But those things no longer reached the center of him. They stayed at the edges, where they belonged. And perhaps, for the first time, he began to see that being misunderstood was not the same as being unseen. Because in his silence, he had started to see himself more clearly than ever before, and that quiet clarity asked for nothing in return. And so his silence remained, but now it no longer felt like something he had fallen into. It felt like something he had chosen. There was a quiet difference in that. Before, the silence had carried uncertainty. It had been filled with questions, with the quiet weight of wondering how he was seen and why he was not understood. It had felt like standing in a place where nothing answered back. Now, It felt steady, not because everything had been resolved, but because something within him no longer needed resolution from the outside. The questions had softened. Some had faded. Others remained, but they no longer demanded immediate answers. They could wait. He moved through his days with the same calm presence, but there was a subtle change in the way he carried himself. Not something others could easily point to, just a quiet shift in how he stood, how he allowed moments to pass without reaching for them. They still spoke around him. They still spoke around him. They still held their quiet beliefs, and sometimes their doubt still brushed against him like a passing wind, but it did not stay. It no longer settled inside him the way it once had. Have you ever noticed how something loses its weight when you stop holding onto it? That was what he was beginning to understand. He was no longer holding their doubt as tightly. Not because it had disappeared, but because he had loosened his grip on it. And in doing so, he had freed something within himself. There was no need to resist them. No need to prove them wrong. No need to turn every silence into a moment of defense. He simply allowed things to be as they were. And strangely, in that allowing, a quiet strength began to settle deeper within him. It was not loud. It did not push outward. It did not seek to be seen or recognized. It simply existed, steady, calm, and unshaken by the shifting opinions around him. He began to trust that feeling, not fully at first, just in small, quiet ways, in the way he chose not to react when something stirred, in the way he let a moment pass without attaching meaning to it, in the way he remained present, even when nothing around him seemed to change, and over time, that trust grew. It became something he could return to, something that did not depend on who believed in him, or who did not, because belief, he was starting to see, was not always something given. Sometimes it is something quietly held, even when no one else offers it. The silence around him no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space. Space to breathe. Space to observe. Space to exist without the constant pull of needing to be understood. And in that space, he found a kind of peace that did not ask for attention. It did not need to be spoken. It did not need to be explained. It was simply there, steady and quiet, like a calm presence that stayed with him no matter what changed around him. They may have still doubted him, but that no longer felt like the center of his world. Because in the quiet, without a single word, he had begun to believe in himself. And somehow, that was enough.